Lord, we thank you for this day. We thank you for your gifts to us, and we thank you especially for the season of Easter when we can celebrate your Son's resurrection and ascension. Please bless our time this evening. Amen.
Amen.
Well, I was supposed to come up with some sort of creative way to get us started today, and then I had a 40-minute conversation with someone, which was very nice that I wasn't expecting. But so we're just going to start, I guess. And this chapter 7 covers 3 pretty broad topics, each of which is its own point of interest. But basically, taking us from Good Friday, after the crucifixion, until Ascension Day, which was 3 days ago now, on Thursday. But I told my parents yesterday, it felt like the book was finally lining up with where we were in the church year after feeling a little weird for the last few weeks about talking about like the crucifixion and all that in the middle of Easter. Like, nah, now we've got the we've got the right chapter for the right week, actually. It's just nice. And next week will be the same because we'll talk about Pentecost next week. So, but I don't know. I guess we can start at the very beginning with the hymn. It's probably the one, other than "O 4,000 Tongues to Sing," it's the one Charles Wesley hymn probably everybody who has a hymnal knows.
And Hark the Herald.
And Hark the Herald Angels, that's true. And Hark the Herald Angels Sing. But I think, I'm going to speak off the top of my head here, but I'm pretty sure this is right. I think the Alleluias were added later on. As with the hymn we sang today, Hail the Day That Sees Him Rise, the middle hymn that we sang in the service, that also, I can say more confidently on that one, the Alleluias were added later on. So it's just kind of reassuring, actually, to think that Charles Wesley didn't write a poem where he ended every single line for like 14 stanzas with Alleluia. It's a nice touch the first time, but maybe if you're not planning to sing it, that does feel like it's a little overkill after a while. But the tune we sing it to, this is interesting. So we sing this in the United Methodist Church to da 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 da. Well, that tune is used in other denominations for a very similarly worded hymn called Jesus Christ is Risen Today, which is not the same hymn as Christ the Lord is Risen Today. It's very close, but it is not the same hymn. It's a hymn. I think it's a translation of a German hymn, actually, but it's very close. But in like the Presbyterian Church, the PCUSA, and the Episcopal Church, that's the tune for that hymn. And the hymn that we sing as Christ the Lord is Risen Today, the tune there is the one that we used in the middle hymn this afternoon for Hail the Day That Sees Him Rise. So most denominations in the U.S., when they sing this Wesley hymn, sing Christ the Lord is risen today, hallelujah. It's a kind of one of those oddities of how hymn texts and hymn tunes don't always match up. And honestly, I'm not even sure what they sing either of those two in England or in Britain, because I often find that the British Methodists have a whole different set of tunes available to them for texts that we find familiar. Text and tune often have very little to do with one another as to how they get paired up. There's your little hymn fact for the day. How about that? So.
Well, how about a comment on this one? The Christ, for this chapter. It's one of the easiest ones that you've given us.
The hymn?
Yeah, easy to understand. Of course, we sing it, but some of the other ones are worded in such a way that, oh boy.
Yeah, good. Yeah. Well, I think I like a lot of Charles Wesley's hymns are like that. They're not usually obscure. sometimes, at least his most famous ones. Yeah. Yeah. All right. So that being said, I think this is one point that's worth repeating. It's a point that a philosopher said to a group I was in when I was in seminary, pointing out that a lot of our hymns at Christmas, he was talking about Christmas, talk about Christ is born today, Jesus is born in Bethlehem, rather than Jesus was born. And the same thing is true with this hymn, although we have some hymns where we'll say Jesus was born, Christ was born, or Christ was raised. But the emphasis, the point he made, which I think is worth thinking about, is that when we say Jesus is risen, we're not just talking about a past event, but talking about like how the whole world kind of revolves around these events in some way. That it's as real for us today as it was or ever will be. So that's a little bit different than like, you know, what happened in 1812 or something like that in terms of a historical event.
Now, would that hold true for the crucifixion as well?
Yeah, I think it holds. I mean, the point that this person was making was although it was really, it holds true for all of Jesus's life in some way, the whole thing. But yeah, in some ways, I would say that's true too. And Charles Wesley in another hymn does that with the crucifixion. Is a hymn in our hymnal. My Lord, the refrain is, my Lord, my love is, my God is crucified. Is crucified, da 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 da. Yeah, that's that. So what Charles at least does that with the crucifixion as well. Although you have others like, alas, and did my Savior bleed, and did my son. So it's not exclusive, but it's just, you know, two different ways of thinking about the same event.
Yeah, and the Apostles' Creed, I think, pretty much puts things in the past tense.
He was crucified, right. He was crucified, dead and buried. He descended to heaven. On the third day, he rose again exactly, right. It's not that it's wrong to use the past tense or something like that, right? That would be misleading and not biblical. But when writers do use the present tense, it gets your attention for the historic present or whatever. Yeah. So Holy Saturday.
Yeah.
Yes.
All right. So this is one of those places where I think there's so little in Scripture about what's going on that it leaves a lot of room very wide open for asking interesting questions and thinking about things, but not necessarily being able to come up with very firm answers. Because, you know, one of the questions that's being asked really is, what happens to Jesus between when he dies and when he is raised from the dead? Is he in some kind of soul sleep, essentially, where he's just kind of comatose? I mean, this is a question about that gets debated about what happens to us too, right? When we die, like, do we have any sort of consciousness of our being dead as human beings when we die? And there's a lot of different answers. Martin Luther, in the Lutheran tradition, taught that we just kind of go to sleep, and then at the last judgment we wake up. But then you have like Jesus telling the thief, "Today you will dine with me in paradise." And many Christians believe that, you know, you have your soul goes to be with Christ, with God in heaven or in paradise of some kind, waiting for the resurrection. So there's a kind of general, like, what happens to us as our consciousness, our minds, our that kind of when we die. And then with Jesus in particular, it kind of gets very pointed about what is going on when his body is in the tomb. So the common answer in the Apostles' Creed is he descended to the dead or he descended to hell. And if you go to any church except for a United Methodist church, or I'm not even sure, probably most Wesleyan tradition churches, that's what you're going to say when you say the Apostles' Creed. You're going to say he descended to the dead or he descended into hell. We are, as far as I know, basically the only denomination in the world that leaves that out. I'm not even sure that our Methodist brothers and sisters do that in England or in South Africa, for example. It's a little bit of a quirk of Methodists that we don't say that phrase.
Because I believe in the universality of Christ's salvation, it's important in my theological perspective that he did go to hell, to where the dead are, because there is nothing that is created, what's created or is, that Jesus is not Lord over. And so he went there. And also, recently, Ira Zepp, we've referred to, said that he believed that even Hitler could be forgiven. But he said his penitence might need to be that he would have to express sorrow to every one of the persons that he was responsible for killing in order to then receive salvation. And it's made me reflect on the concept of purgatory in the Catholic tradition. This is the step where you're given the chance to accept the grace that God and Jesus are offering you. That because there's also the concept that none will be lost. And in Matthew 18, when he's talking about the lost sheep parable, at the end of that, he says, my father does not wish for any of you children to be lost. And so it's almost like coming from outside the biblical understanding of things to have to have Jesus make this trip in order to prove or demonstrate his complete sovereignty all over everything.
Yeah, so definitely, I mean, that's the kind of most common reason for saying that Jesus did. That's the longest standing. Let's put it that way. As we say in the chapter, there's another reason that comes up in the Reformation, relatively more recent, only 500 years ago instead of like 1,500 years ago, but basically yesterday in historical times. But yeah, the notion that if there's some part of death that Jesus doesn't experience, then that's part of death that Jesus doesn't have sovereignty over. And so, I think for many Christians in the first 1,000 to 1,500 years of the church, they would have said that Jesus did not go to hell to preach to someone like Hitler, but he might have gone to preach to someone like Adam or David or others. And in a sense, what they were saying was when Adam or David died, there wasn't really a hell. It was just Sheol. It was where you went when you died. And it wasn't miserable. It was just kind of a shady life, half-life. And some Christians, like Augustine and others, would have also said like virtuous pagans, like they would have said maybe Socrates or Plato or someone like that might have also been in this same state. But they would have said, but if someone was like a a terrible murderer, Jesus was like, you're already too late for you, kind of a deal for them. And that, people like Adam and Socrates and Eve and those would get the chance to accept, to see Jesus for themselves and be redeemed. And then that way Jesus would show that God's sovereignty extends everywhere and is not limited. And that's one reason to accept the teaching very much. With purgatory, purgatory is definitely not a Methodist teaching. We don't accept that we don't talk about that. But the Catholic Church teaches as an extension of heaven. It's like heaven's front porch, kind of a deal. So if you're in purgatory, you've already made it. You just have a little more time before you get to paradise, as it were, which is different from being in hell.
Yeah, and it's too bad the medieval church made such kind of a mockery of that concept when they were having, you could pray somebody out of purgatory, or, you could buy certain dispensations and your grandfather would get get quicker entrance out of purgatory and heaven.
Right, so there was a healthy side and a less healthy side to that. The healthy side was that and again, I'm not endorsing the Catholic doctrine of purgatory, just so we're clear, I'm just explaining it. But the healthy side was this idea that you are still in relationship with those who have departed. And just as you can pray for your friend or your neighbor or so on, you could pray for those people. In fact, most people don't know this, but you can still get indulgences for your loved ones in purgatory, even today.
Really?
Yep, absolutely, yes. The Pope still grants indulgences. But the less, the less good side of this was how much money certain people in the church were making off of these indulgences by selling them, essentially. And that's what got Martin Luther, part of what got Martin Luther so angry, was to travel to Rome and see what that money was going toward, but he wasn't the only one who was upset about that kind of a deal. But yeah, purgatory is its own kind of, and in some way there would have been there's no need for Jesus to go a separate trip to purgatory, because purgatory has already assumed that you are in a saving relationship. You've just died with some additional sin of some kind. But the trip to hell extends God's sovereignty. The other version, more recently, is to say, well, from the Reformation, not more recently, really, is to say that, it's important to say that whatever a human being might go through is what Jesus went through when Jesus died. And especially a condemned human being who becomes sin for us, even, as Paul says at some point, that it's important that that human being get the full judgment, so that we can be completely redeemed from that. And John Wesley seems to have objected to that part a little bit. He didn't like the idea that Jesus was made to suffer the torments of hell, whatever those may be. He didn't like that idea. And so that's probably why he took the article out of the Articles of Religion when he gave it to the North American Methodists. He just didn't. But if he had met someone or read someone like Thomas Aquinas, he probably would have been more comfortable with the doctrine and recognized that there were other ways of talking about it without emphasizing Jesus being given the sufferings of the damned, which he really thought was. And I can sympathize with this. That doesn't quite seem consistent with what we need to believe. But anyhow, yeah. So go ahead, Larry.
Thomas Aquinas understood hell to have different parts to it.
Yep.
And that I've always been thinking about, and I don't know if it's still a practice or a belief in the Catholic Church, with the unborn child or the child that dies early prior to christening or baptism, Would that be an upper level of hell, or limbo, I think is what they used to call it or call it?
Right, so that's limbo, and that was a teaching of the church that has been set aside. The Roman Catholic Church does not speak of limbo any longer. And it was, as you said, it was a kind of a in-between place for children who had not been baptized, but also had not reached an age of maturity where they could properly do wrong for themselves, as it were. So they weren't condemned to hell. You know, Thomas Aquinas, I've read the sections on Thomas Aquinas about the different levels of hell. And Thomas Aquinas is not always the easiest read to begin with. And I have to say that this is among his more difficult sections in his writings. So I'm not entirely clear how he thinks of this, actually. But he seems to have some notion that I think he sees hell as in at least two parts. One, more like the Old Testament Sheol, where it's just kind of, you're dead, and that's it. And that's enough of a not good thing by itself. And then another one where you're dead and boy, you really had a terrible life and you're getting what's coming to you. And that's kind of real hell. And that's the best I can come up with from Aquinas. But that seems to be how he thought of it, which is kind of close to, you know, an Old Testament view of Sheol, as it were.
What about Dante? Would he have, I mean, he wouldn't have read, I mean, most regular people wouldn't have read Thomas Aquinas, but they would have been influenced by his teachings, right?
Yeah, I don't know if any of you have ever read Dante's like the Inferno or any of those books, the poems, but yeah, actually Dante is probably Thomas Aquinas's, in some ways, one of his most important interpreters from the Middle Ages. He really had read a lot of Thomas Aquinas.
Oh, okay.
But of course, Dante takes this to an extreme, and he depicts, you know, 9 circles of hell, each one with its own kind of set of punishments that are fitting to the way the person lived. I don't think Thomas Aquinas thought that way at all, but Dante had a very vivid imagination and also had a lot of grudges and axes to grind with people in Florence who he really didn't like. And so he had fun creating a lot of different ways to think of how they might be and getting paid back for all their terrible deeds.
Might not have been really a theological treatise.
You know, in some ways it is, but not always in its specifics. It is in the sense of, I mean, he hits on some good, there are some real deep truths in one of the deepest things in the Inferno is that Satan, we often think of hell as, you know, fire and brimstone and all this kind of stuff, but in Dante's version, Satan is encased in ice, and he's basically frozen in place at the lowest depths of hell. And in the Middle Ages, movement was associated with God because movement was love. And so there is a kind of statement that as the further you get from God, the less in movement you are, because the further you are from love. And Satan in Dante's depiction is about as far from love as you can get. And so he can't move. He has no motion of his self. Whereas if you read Paradiso, it gets brighter and things move more steadily in harmony with God's own motion of love. So I had my students read the Paradiso this semester, so they hated it. No, one of them hated it. So
Have you read the middle one? I haven't read either Purgatory or Paradise. Just
I've heard that Purgatorio is actually the most theological of the three, but I haven't read it. Anyhow, let's move on. Resurrection. We're still in Easter season. Easter season is 50 days, so we get 8 more days, including till next Sunday. Pentecost is the last feast of Easter. So
we need to be making more desserts this week, is what you're saying.
we need to be making more desserts this week. That's right. This is your last week to party before you go back to ordinary time. I guess we'll have to, I don't know how many of you were able to do this. We put Christmas lights on, or Easter lights on our house, and we've been lighting them up just about every night and all that. I guess they'll have to come down on Monday next week or something like that. But they'll be saying yes. I think the part in this chapter that about the resurrection that I wish to talk about most is about misidentifying Jesus.
Yes, that was a very interesting concept. It's almost like you cannot understand it just because of the miss put in front of identifying. There's something much deeper that's being pointed to here, which took a little struggle to get through. Before we get to that, could I just,
Yeah.
the beginning of the section, you were talking in the second paragraph, you talk about several important signs of Christ's resurrection. And first there's the empty tomb. And then you mention a number of specific appearances. And then you say, in addition to the appearances, and then there are another set of appearances. Well, witnesses. I don't quite understand the distinction between the appearances and the witnesses and all those kinds of things.
Signs of Christ's resurrection.
Right. So I think the appearances are, the emphasis is the event, and the witnesses is the emphasis of firsthand knowledge. And if you look at the early church, we have both of those throughout the New Testament. So you have all 4 Gospels talking about events of Jesus coming, appearing after the resurrection in some important way. And those events have enough kind of substance to be stories, whether it's the story of Jesus at the beach, or the story of Thomas, or the story of the disciples on the road to Emmaus. And if you look through the rest of the New Testament, like in Paul's letters, for example, you get a little bit of this from time to time of his appearances. But the other side of it is the people who actually see the appearances, and those become also an important strand in the New Testament, in kind of quasi-independent from the appearances. So like in 1 John, you get what we have seen, the author is trying to say, we saw all this. Or in 1 Peter, the same thing happens. And even in Paul's own lists, trying to say, look, these people are still around who saw him. You can go talk to them. You can go find them and talk to them yourselves. And so you have, obviously you don't have events without having people there to see them, but they become kind of parallel tracks in the New Testament. Sometimes they're told at the same time. Sometimes they're kind of told separately, depending on what the author in the New Testament is trying to talk about the resurrection. So the events are like, look, this really happened. We have stories about this. And the eyewitnesses are about, look, you can find these people. You can look them up in the telephone book and call them, and you can you can ask them, did this really happen? Hello.
Hi, Mark. It's Ruth Ann. I'm a little late.
Hi, Ruth Ann. Good to hear from you. How are you doing?
I'm doing okay.
Good.
Fair to middling.
Fair to middle. We were just talking about the resurrection a little and about the appearances and the eyewitnesses.
Yes.
The eyewitnesses would be early in the resurrection, and the appearances come a little bit later. Is that kind of the distinction?
Well, no, actually, if you look at, so like the earliest writings in the New Testament are Paul's writings, and Paul only really talks kind of vaguely about the appearances, but he does name specific people as eyewitnesses. So, you know, for him, it's more he has a little bit of about the appearances and more an emphasis on the people who saw it. And then as you know, when the Gospels are written, which are 30 or 40 years after Paul's writings, then you get the stories of the appearances as well as some of the eyewitnesses. But Paul talks about some eyewitnesses who we don't really get in either the Gospel or Acts. He talks about appearing before 500, but we don't know who these 500 are, and that story isn't recorded in either the Gospels or in Acts. But he also doesn't name the 500, so you know he doesn't give all 500 names either of the people who were there. So it seems more that, at least early on, Paul had a better sense of who than what in some cases, and that as the stories of the church were passed on, that's when and started to be written down, then the what became part of it as well in the more specifics.
The beautiful part is that there's so much of it, and we have that to work with. It's great. And some of the ghost-like, I guess I would call appearances, I would call mystical, and must have been very difficult to understand as disciples.
Yeah, certainly Jesus doesn't. You know, he eats. You know that he eats on a couple of occasions, and so ghosts don't eat. But you're right. He passes through locked doors, and he kind of is there one moment, and then he's gone again. I kind of like the way C.S. Lewis depicts this in a book called The Great Divorce, which is a kind of it's not about Jesus' resurrection. It's about paradise. It's about heaven. And in his depiction, heaven isn't more spiritual, but it's more physical. So it's actually harder than regular matter. And I like that kind of depiction where it's actually this material, our regular world, passes through Jesus rather than Jesus passing through our material almost. It kind of flips the understanding a bit. That world is more real, more substantive, and how C.S. Lewis writes about it. I'm not saying that's what actually is true. It just is a nice way of, it's a different way of thinking about it. But yeah, there are appearances. I think mystical is a good word for it in some cases, Larry. It certainly catches the disciples off guard.
Well, we've talked about the disciples in chapters before and how they were having trouble interpreting the words of Jesus and the parables and the whatever. What would it have been like for us to be disciples in trying to do that? It must have been a difficult task to fully grasp Jesus. Yeah. It would have been. I don't think any of us would have fared all that much better than I think that's one of the points of the New Testament is that don't be too hard on these guys. You wouldn't have done much better yourself. True. But yeah. I think, also I would say that's one of the things that makes the New Testament to me so credible in some ways, because they're writing in many cases about themselves or about people they know. And the writers of the New Testament have every incentive to make it seem like they just got it from start to finish. Like the disciples just kind of understood and followed Jesus. And they're like, yeah, of course we get this. Because they're now the authority figures that people are relying on. And instead, they look like bumpkins most of the time who barely can put 1 plus 1 together. That's not usually how you want your leaders to come off. So I don't mean to be too hard on them, but they often just are clueless, and they had a lot of incentive to show themselves in a better light, and they don't take it up.
Was it Larry who just was speaking?
Yeah.
I was sort of agreeing, what he said about, how would it be to be there? And it's almost kind of disturbing to think about that they couldn't recognize Jesus, because these were people who did know him and who were, saw him a lot and knew him when he was here on earth. And like the thought of, if they couldn't recognize him, how could we? And I guess that's where we have to go with, if you do it for the least of these sort of thing. But just that, but it is also comforting to think like, well, Peter and Paul were, are considered great saints, but they messed up all the time. So.
Oh.
It's a great boon to all the rest of us that we don't have to bump. Yeah, we can make it along as bumpkins.
Right. Yeah.
Well, we probably have a hard time putting our thinking, our minds back into a time in which they live. I mean, we're people who know everything, or could conceivably know everything. These guys wouldn't have known very much at all about anything except their own experience, their own small life experience, small geographically, small in every way, really. And when you think of the whole world. So for them, it must have been such a huge leap to make this realization, or to make to come to this understanding of who Jesus was.
Yeah. Huh. So the misrecognition, I think that's an interesting place to where, where I think, again, I can't take credit for this part either. This is definitely Edgardo's insight here, where this misrecognition becomes, instead of just a bad thing about the disciples, but actually becomes part of the gospel in some way, or is relatable to part of the gospel. That I don't think this redeems the disciples exactly for missing Jesus. I think it's rather a matter of Jesus using opportunities in different ways. But we continue to, as Edgardo says, misidentify Jesus in all sorts of ways that are not negative, but are actually essential. Jesus invites us to do in the sacrament of Holy Communion, or in serving the poor, and in each other even. We say, oh, I see Jesus. Well, there's some misrecognition there, but not in a bad way. I think that's an interesting.
Yeah, that Mother Teresa quote that's so famous.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, the other thing that maybe we miss out on, and we didn't talk about this in the chapter as much, but just before the ascension, the disciples asked Jesus, is this when you're going to restore the kingdom to Israel? And I think that's important too, because it shows that even after 40 days of teaching and instruction and appearances, even then the disciples are still kind of holding on to some sense of something not being complete, and trying to figure out what the whole thing is left, and I think that's really interesting. Like there's here their Messiah, their Lord is raised from the dead, and they're like, there's still something else, isn't there? Isn't there something else left? And they're using the language that they know, about the restoration of the kingdom. But Jesus doesn't say, you know, you're wrong, there's nothing left. He says, that's not for you to know about. I just think that's interesting. Being around Jesus didn't make them think, well, this is it. This is as good as it's going to get. They're like, we're ready for the rest now. Let's do this. So, yeah. That takes us then to the ascension. And I have to say that as the longer I am a pastor, and also the more I spend time with the New Testament, the more I think about the ascension, which is probably something I barely gave a second thought for a very long time. I don't ever recall hearing much about the ascension in church, or talking about it much. I don't know about others. Would others agree with that
Not
experience?
until I went to France and it was the day off school and work for everyone.
Yeah, it's in France. It's still a day off, even now. Like, France is a completely secular country, but Ascension is still a day off. So also in Italy and in Spain, I think it's a day off. I remember it was a day. What's that?
Right along with
Muted.
right along with May 8th for VE Day. So
VE Day, right?
Busy
But
month for days off in Europe.
I remember I used to think, why would they take Ascension off? What's the big deal? I mean, like Easter, I understand. But why take Ascension Day off? What's the big deal? I don't think that anymore.
Having worked with a number of pastors on the worship committee, I know Ascension seemed for them to always be like, maybe we could skip this and just move on.
Yeah.
It seemed to confound all of us, certainly me, but I mean, you know, ways to talk about it, ways to portray it. What do we put in the sanctuary to connote that this is Ascension Day? Always a difficult conversation.
Yeah. Always has been.
I think part of that is because, oh, sorry, was I interrupting someone? I think part of that is because there's a kind of Elvis has left the building read of this story that just they're like, well, now what do we do? That's probably not the best way to read this story. I remember having a pastor one time tell me, I don't know why he went on this. It was completely out of the blue, but he was like, you know, if Jesus had really ascended, and even if he was moving at near light speed, he'd still be like 2,000 years later, he'd still be in our galaxy. He's kind of making the point that it wasn't a literal ascension or something like that. You know, I think I understood what he was trying to say, but it was a kind of Elvis has left the building kind of take on the passage, and still, and I think what we're trying to offer here is a little bit different approach, which is less about the physical or spiritual event of the ascension as to like what's actually happening, as much as to the significance of it. And if you read through the history of the church writing about this, it's consistently falls on a notion of Jesus ascending as king. It's a kingly ascension primarily, not a escape hatch ascension.
You're gonna roll your eyes, but it's like Coronation Day in Frozen.
Like Coronation Day in Frozen, great. Yeah, something like that.
I think the ascension is quite important because I think we should do something at our churches next year for Ascension Day on a Thursday.
I think that's a great idea. It's hard because we're not used to go. I mean, it's hard to get people to go to church in Holy Week on Thursday, and we're just not used to it. And oftentimes I will make this Sunday, today, Ascension Sunday, and that'll be the focus of my sermon. I didn't do that today because I wanted a different, I was up for something different this year, honestly. But yeah, it is we were talking about this yesterday. In the Catholic Church, it still is considered what's called a holy day of obligation, where Catholics are supposed to go to Mass if they could. So our in our chapter, what we talk about is what sometimes is called the threefold office of Christ. And this is something we don't talk about as much in our churches today as we might ought to, but it's a way of restating a point I made a few weeks ago, that with the suffering and the crucifixion, it's not just one passage or one line, but this notion that Jesus is taking all of Israel's story and kind of bearing it on his shoulders as he goes from Palm Sunday to the cross. And the threefold office is a shorthand for understanding that. In one way of looking at Israel's history, you have kings, you have priests, and you have prophets as the kind of main figures in Israel's story. Of course, we know there are people like Ruth who are none of those things are just as important, if not more important. So it's not the whole story, but it's an important way of looking at it, and that Jesus takes all of these roles and fulfills all of them. And when he ascends as the king who's going to his throne and has, as Jack said earlier, sovereignty over all, not just over Israel or Jerusalem. He ascends as the kind of high priest, as we read in Hebrews, and he enters the Holy of Holies, which is a kind of ascension also for the high priest. And then he ascends as the prophet, kind of like Elijah, when Elijah is taken up into heaven with the chariots of heaven. And so this event of the ascension kind of captures all three of those at once, just like Jesus' crucifixion kind of takes on all of Israel's story at once in a similar way.
So I have a question. In the paragraph you quoted from John Wesley, he seems to also identify Savior and Messiah as different from priest, prophet, and king.
Yeah.
So, is that a reasonable understanding of that paragraph?
I think that's one way to read it. I might say that he understood the three offices as all explaining how he is Messiah. So there may be a sentence missing, not actually missing, that Wesley could say, I believe that Jesus of Nazareth is the Savior of the world and the Messiah so long foretold, and this is so because of he was prophet, he was priest, he was king, anointed by the Holy Spirit. And I guess the reason for that is because of the relationship of the terms. Here, Wesley is really putting the emphasis on the fact that Messiah means anointed one, and he talks about Jesus being the anointed one in these three ways. That's a reading of the Old Testament story that you have to stretch a little to find a prophet who was really anointed. Priests were anointed, kings were anointed, prophets, there's maybe one who was anointed, but many prophets weren't anointed that we know of, at least. That's the direction he's going there.
Although I guess you could, stretch it metaphorically.
Yeah.
That, God anointed the prophets through some fashion or another. Most of them felt
Right.
that God had laid God's hand on them to, speak God's word.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
sort of-
Right. Yes.
sort of an anointing activity, I guess.
Yeah.
So, with the priest aspect of we're going into where God is, like the old priest would go into the place where God was in the temple or in the tabernacle. I think that's a little bit helpful for us because, I mean, it's hard for us not to think of the ascension as that Elvis has left the building or the going away just because we don't see Jesus. We can't see him physically and we can't be physically in his presence. But the way you talk about the priesthood here, but also I think I read this in because Malcolm Gate will share his poems on Twitter, and he shared his ascension poem this week on Twitter, and I think there was something there about Jesus bringing us to the Father through ascension, and sort of that way of looking at it kind of helps with the getting away from the going away from us feeling of ascension.
A sense of being taken with Jesus,
Yeah.
in spirit at least, if not physically at the moment, to like I said about now you know what our house sounds like all the time. You know, like I said this morning, where we don't know what Jesus is saying in the prayers, but we know Jesus is offering us up in prayer. That's part of what Hebrews teaches, is that Jesus prays for us and offers us to God. The other thing which I thought you were going to say, which is not what you said, but is true, when the high priest entered the Holy of Holies, no one saw him. You couldn't see the high priest in the Holy of Holies. That was part of the point, was it was kind of set aside, but no one thought that the high priest had kind of, you know, checked out. He was doing important work there, and you trusted that he was doing the work because that was the whole point of going there in the first place.
All right, Lady and the Tramp, final music is playing, so we have to wrap this up.
Okay. So, well, we're almost out of time anyhow. We're near the end. I guess what I'd reiterate here is that, you know, Jesus, the last thing is that Jesus explicitly says he ascends so that the Spirit can come. There's this kind of making way for the Spirit. So again, and because the Spirit continues the work of God in the world, it's not about Jesus leaving so much as the next phase in this plan of salvation that God has for us, which we are still in now, as it are some 2,000 years later. And that means that next week, when we are gathered, we'll be on our second to last chapter, which is on the Pentecost, and also looking at Jesus as someone filled with the Spirit. And then I thought it's kind of up to you. We could end next week and try to do both chapters next week, 8 and 9, or we could go till June 1st and do the last chapter on June 1st and kind of wrap up. So I wanted to get your sense of what you wanted to do with that. Whether you wanted to try to get both or do another week.
Well, Confessing Christ 9 is fairly short, so it could work either way for me.
Yeah, I think it's 3 pages or something like that, 3 or 4.
Why don't we try to do both chapters?
Okay.
Yeah.
Us have a strong feeling one way or the other?
Right, the 2 chapters are about as long as the rest of the other chapters were, about 10 minutes. So
Yeah.
we should be able to manage
Okay.
that.
Well, then I'll make sure I include that in the email for next week, but we'll wrap up next week then.
Mark, Larry, can I back up for 1 minute?
Of course, yeah.
To page 66, it won't take long.
No, it's fine.
To the paragraph, Hail Jesus, hail our great high priest. Glorious rest. I don't think of it that way.
Yeah. Is that an objection or an insight that you're?
about Jesus ascending,
Mm-hmm.
and he's up there on the right hand. He's not resting, I wouldn't think.
Okay. Yeah.
Or are we talking about the rest on Saturday?
You know, it isn't the. You're right. It's not the same rest as Saturday. I don't know. I'm not going to go out on a limb for Charles here, but I'm guessing that, you know, in some way you could think of it as a rest in that the
Comparing it to what he went through, but perhaps.
right and the human nature of Jesus, the fully human part of Jesus is now completely with God eternally, which we would say is rest for us. So it's a,
Still 1,000 years to sing the songs again.
right. So yeah, I hear what you're saying, Larry. I mean, it's not the first word we think of. It's when we think of that. I would, yeah.
But I think there is a concept of, you know, resting in God's embrace, which is not of not doing anything, but a sense of comfort.
Mhm.
And comfort actually comes from with strength. So, you know, to me, that you kind of work it that way too. That
Yeah,
it's
okay.
not rest, you're given strength to do what you need to do.
Yeah. Yeah. Very good. Thank you, Larry, for bringing us back to that. I appreciate it.
That's fine. I'm sorry to cause
No.
backup.
No, there's no,
We kind of passed through it, didn't we?
we did. That's fine. All right. I'm going to stop our recording and then we're going to share prayer requests.